Welcome to IVF This, episode 110, Disenfranchised Grief. Welcome to IVF This. I'm your host, Emily Ginn. After 10 years of primary and secondary infertility due to both male and female factor infertility, I am now the mother to 3 beautiful miracles. I am married to my favorite person in the world. I'm a social worker, a life coach, and an IVF warrior. I'm here to teach you how to manage your mind and emotions during your IVF journey, to break free from anxiety and regain control of your life, even in the midst of infertility. I'm going to teach you how to say IVF this to how we think about, talk about, and experience infertility. Let's go. Hello, my beautiful friends. I hope you are all doing so well today. I just had the pleasure of seeing my first hummingbird of spring. I have this really big, beautiful window in my office that looks right off into my front lawn. And I have some flowers, and I got to see a couple of hummingbirds kind of flit by as I was writing this episode. And I love hummingbirds very much. I do have a hummingbird feeder that my husband loves to remind me that we spent like $50 on an outdoor store. I can't remember where, but I was really excited to have it. And then I started reading about all the stuff that you have to do, like boiling down the sugar in the water, and you have to clean it out every couple of days to make sure it doesn't spoil and hurt the hummingbirds, of course. And that's a lot of physical investment for me, particularly with my ADHD brain. It's just a lot more than I'm willing to commit to at this time. So it is like a little bit of a treat when I do get to see the hummingbirds without having to subject myself to all that work. Like they'll probably never make it a consistent stop on their schedule to come see me. But I am really, really happy when I do get to see them. But so if there's something like that in your life, some small joy, I hope that you get to experience that today. And why not? Because let's talk about disenfranchised grief, because who doesn't enjoy talking about grief? I mean, technically I do, but I know that that's not an emotion that most people experience when talking about grief. So the reason that I want to cover disenfranchised grief specifically is because its very name is a grief that is not recognized. Now, that might not apply to you or your situation, but I want all of us to be aware of it so we can, at the very least, support ourselves if that's what's happening, or we can also support someone else who might be experiencing it as well. And you might have experienced it, maybe not even known it, right? And hopefully this episode might help you validate some of that experience. So I'm going to explain what disenfranchised grief is. I'm going to give you plenty of examples so that you can recognize it, my own personal experience with it, and then give you some suggestions on how you can support yourself while you're experiencing disenfranchised grief. So first, what the hell is disenfranchised grief? So disenfranchised grief is a term that was coined by Kenneth Doka, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, in the 80s. And it basically is when someone's society, someone's culture denies them the need, the right, the role, or the capacity to grieve. In other words, disenfranchised grief is when the loss goes against cultural norms and it's not seen as valid by those in a person's network or community. And it's not openly acknowledged, it's not socially mourned, nor is it publicly supported. And as you can imagine, there is a tremendous amount of nuance to this subject. So for the purposes of making this podcast friendly, I'm going to simplify things and I'm adding a bit of my own thoughts and experiences. And for those of you who are interested in grief theory, because who isn't, and you want to learn a little bit more, I would recommend checking out Doka's book, which is appropriately titled Disenfranchised Grief. So before we break this down, I want to give you some examples because I think it's important to pause and remind ourselves that grief is in no way limited to a death loss. Although that is how culturally we tend to think of grief or what is associated with grief. And while we most commonly think of grief as a result of someone's death, non-death losses are just as valid as death losses. I like to think of grief as a person's thoughts, feelings, and actions following a perceived or real loss, right? Thoughts, feelings, and actions following a perceived loss. And since perception is unique and individual, then so is grief. And so what one person believes is a loss might not be a loss to another person, because it's all about perception. So let's break down disenfranchised grief and give some examples. Doka suggests that disenfranchised grief can happen when the loss isn't seen as worthy of grief. So for instance, a non-person death loss could be the loss of a pet or the death of someone you didn't really know, but maybe admired or appreciated. For me, Robin Williams' death was very hard because I admired him. I loved his work, things like that, right? A death of someone maybe who abused you or hurt you could be a loss that isn't seen as worthy of grief, right? Some other non-fertility, non-IVF examples would be maybe the loss of something you really expected or that was really important to you, but other people around you was like, why was it so important to you? Maybe you had your hopes up for a job, or maybe you had your hopes up for the perfect vacation. Maybe you had your hopes up for something that you were planning on coming or planning on happening, but it didn't come to fruition. Now, of course, for the purpose of this podcast, we're going to talk about disenfranchised grief and things like a cycle that yields no or few embryos, with the understanding that the outcome kind of breaches your expectations. A transfer that fails to implant or that results in a miscarriage, any miscarriage at all. If you're doing genetic testing and some or all of the embryos are not genetically normal, that is not what you would expect. Hell, even for some of us, the process of infertility and IVF as a whole, like the fact that it is our best chance for pregnancy, that in and of itself is a type of disenfranchised grief. And to you, it's a big deal, but other people might not see it that way. So the loss isn't seen from society or an onlooker's perspective as worthy of grief. Or for a lot of what we experience during infertility and IVF, many people don't even see that as something to grieve, right? That a person grieving is not recognized as a griever, or also that the way we are grieving is stigmatized. So maybe you aren't displaying an outward grief, or maybe you're displaying what other people might deem to be an extreme grief response. Since infertility and IVF, for those of us who don't have a lived experience, our outward displays of grief or sadness or whatever can seem incongruent with their expectations, remember, whoever they might be. And I think this is never more apparent than when people maybe see us upset, or maybe we're sharing our frustration or our struggle, and the response is, you just need to relax, or something obnoxiously in that vein, because our reaction is disproportionate to their expectations, right? So we can be judged by our culture and by others, and we can judge ourselves in a number of ways. And this is the judgment that results in disenfranchised grief. And you can imagine the potential for intersectionality. Now, if you're not familiar with that term, intersectionality is a framework that was developed in the late 80s, early 90s by Kimberly Crenshaw. She's a legal scholar. She's amazing. And it's a framework to help you understand how a person's various social, political identities combine to create different modes of discrimination and privilege. Now, I'm not going to get into the weeds about all of this right now because, believe me, I could. But intersectionality is really important because there are many cultures around the world that have a lot of varying views around infertility, IVF, grief, emotional expression, vulnerability, etc. So if you belong to a group that maybe places all of the social stigma around infertility on a woman, regardless of the diagnosis, that could be an aspect of intersectionality. Because beliefs around grief are not specific to social culture, say in the US, but also pertains to your culture of origin or the culture that you have been raised in, maybe as a Black person, as an Indigenous person, or another person of color around the world, we cannot discount those experiences, and that is what is involved in intersectionality. I mentioned that I'd share an experience from my disenfranchised grief. And before I do that, I want to add that another way to think about disenfranchised grief using the think, feel, do model that I teach is that disenfranchised grief is when other people have thoughts about your grief, and somehow that grief is less than or invalid, or we think they do. Right? We assume that that's what they're thinking. Because sometimes people share their thoughts with us, and sometimes we just assume we know what they're thinking. And the latter is what I struggled with unknowingly, of course. I created an experience of disenfranchised grief for myself
even after I had been coaching for a while. So because of our embryo transfer that failed in September of 2020, I will say that my family, my community was very supportive, very compassionate. I got nothing but love and support from them. But I think that through that experience, and because we have arguably had otherwise great success with IVF, that some people might think that my grief would be less valid because we did at that time already have 2 healthy kiddos, or that my grief through, at that point, we were about 7 years into our journey, would seem less valid. All of this happened around the time I had pivoted from general life coaching to this more specialized IVF coaching. Now, no one ever explicitly said anything to suggest that that was true. No one ever looked at me really crossways. I literally had little to no evidence of this story. And so what I later concluded, and what I now know, is that I was really just projecting my own thoughts about my loss, about my journey, onto this like nebulous they, right? Whoever the hell they are, right? I was very worried what people would think, what they would think, right? Even though no one had said a word. But what was happening is that I was having these thoughts about grief, and my grief being less valid because we had experienced success with IVF. So I had a lot of thoughts about how that might make my grief less valid. And that matters because my own thoughts about other people potentially not accepting my story and my grief almost kept me from working with my beloved IVFers. Like, I almost did that to myself. And I can't even begin to tell you how grateful I am that I figured this out, and my coach at the time to help me figure this out. Because if I hadn't, I guarantee you this podcast wouldn't exist. All of the women that I have helped and worked directly with, either in my coaching program or you wonderful women who have benefited from the podcast, it wouldn't exist. It wouldn't be here because of that. And I tell you this story not because I think you're probably going to become a coach at some point, but because I don't want you to make the same mistake in whatever kind of way that could manifest in your life. If I can save you from potentially making that mistake, I want to do that. Maybe you're noticing yourself worrying what other people might think, but you're not questioning whether there's anything to actually be worried about. Frankly, I'll tell you that even if they are having thoughts about your grief, it's still nothing to worry about. But I don't want to put you onto something like on yourself that didn't almost exist in reality. Like there was no evidence for it. So if you're experiencing disenfranchised grief, here's what if you're experiencing disenfranchised grief, here's what I would suggest. And truthfully, I suggest this for all of you. If you're in grief, all of this applies, but especially if you're experiencing disenfranchised grief. Remember, all your feelings are valid. Even if nobody understands them, it doesn't matter. The loss was significant for you. In fact, the more significant the loss was, the more intense your emotions will be. And that is all unique to you and your perception of the loss. So don't tell yourself that you shouldn't feel the way you feel, or that you don't have any right to experience grief, or whatever that narrative might be. And the more you can open up to the truth of how you feel, and of course, how you feel is caused by your thoughts, but it doesn't even matter because we're already thinking those thoughts and we're already having those feelings. And the more we can open up to that, the more we can process those emotions instead of resisting or avoiding them. And then that's a lot easier. It will be so much easier to integrate and adapt to that loss. Don't make it a condition that other people need to understand your feelings in order for you to process them and take care of yourself. If you make your grief dependent on other people's support, then you will always be trying to change something that you can't. It's impossible for us to control other people. So don't make your feelings conditional upon the support and understanding of others. Remind yourself that you do not owe anyone an explanation. This grief is your grief. You get to decide who you share it with, how you navigate it, all of it. It's yours. You don't need to explain or justify yourself to anyone. Allowing yourself to own your grief doesn't actually make the grief harder. The grief is going to be there no matter what. It just makes it yours. You have agency over it. It gives you the power to manage it, handle it, and adapt to it in a completely personal way, a personal experience. And that is such a beautiful and precious gift to give yourself. And I want all of you to experience that gift. So this is what I have for you today. I hope the explanation of disenfranchised grief was helpful to you. Maybe you saw some of your own experiences in what I talked about. Maybe some other people came to mind, and now you kind of understand their struggles a little bit more and why it might be a little bit harder for them based on their unique circumstances, and you find that useful. Leaning into that compassion for yourself and others, that is the end game, my friends. That is all from me this week. I hope you have a wonderful week, and I will talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of IVF This. If you like what you've heard, click subscribe and follow to make sure you don't miss an episode. And if you want to learn more, head over to www.ivfthiscoaching.com to learn how to work together.